Welcome to the Human Capital Reporting module. You know, I'm not sure I even like the term human capital, but then I didn't really like personnel, and I never liked human resource management either. I'd much rather refer to people as people, human beings. But in fact, human capital is a name that's stuck really, and I think it's because organisations that are always trying to improve under lots and lots of pressure have managed all the other resources as well as they can. And funnily enough, the one resource that they really need to manage well, people, they could do a lot better at. And that's why there's been a pressure on organisations to at least gauge how they manage this particular type of capital, whether we like the name or not. Now, as you go through this module, I think what you will find is that even asking this question is quite revolutionary, quite radical. To say to an organisation, do you get the best value out of your human capital? Especially when you know that they don't have a ready-made way of measuring human capital and answering this question. So if we are really talking about a revolutionary idea here, maybe we need to take this one step at a time just to see how big a subject this really is. This is the Human Capital Reporting module. Human Capital Reporting is a radical, revolutionary idea. Almost as revolutionary as Galileo telling us that it's actually the Earth that goes round the Sun and not the other way around. This is going to challenge a lot of people's conventional thinking about managing people. So we're going to start by looking at do we make a distinction when we manage people between soft and hard measures. We then move on to what sort of evidence will tell us that we are managing people well. Then we'll have a look at a definition of human capital management, and we'll apply this sort of thinking to look at 3 airlines, and then we'll look at the market capitalisation of a range of companies and start to do some detective work to find out which of these seem to manage their people better. Then we'll move into the public sector by looking at some figures for the UK's NHS, one of the largest employers in the world, before moving on to a matrix that looks at a combination of business and HR strategy, and we'll finish off with a simple human capital management report. When we have conversations with senior operational managers, they often regard HR as pink and fluffy. They think it's about soft things and not really about the hard performance indicators that they're used to working with. So let's just put this idea to the test. Here are 2 managers who are asked the question, what is the distinction between soft and hard? And we've given them a whole host of thought bubbles using the sort of words that we all use every day. So we have things like changing culture, communicating, raising morale, developing people, motivating, counselling. And all of these things on the surface look as though they might be soft. At the same time, there are words like making a profit, reducing cost, and selling. And if you ask 2 managers what is the distinction between these 2 types of phrases or words, they'd be very hard pushed to come up with a clear distinction. Really, there's only one simple lesson from this slide, is that all of these things, if they are worth doing at all, will have a hard impact on the business. Let us take something like counselling. If you offer a counselling service to employees, is it because we want to be seen as a nice employer, or is it because we want them to come back to work and work at a very high performing level? Now actually we might want both, but the thing that we would measure at the end of the day to say whether counselling is worth it or not surely is in terms of how the business performs. We want the best of both worlds. We want people to feel like they're being looked after, but we also want them to perform. There is absolutely no distinction between hard and soft to be made when we're talking about human capital. What this soft-hard debate really leads us into is a discussion of evidence-based management. So for example, if you have an engagement survey that says the employees are engaged or satisfied or have the right attitude, what does that actually mean? Is that soft evidence or is that hard evidence? And there's been a growing belief in the need for better evidence-based management, both in the private commercial sector and the public sector. Because if we're running things like health services and we ask the questions, are the people who work in the health service really engaged with trying to look after patients, give the best care possible? We need evidence that that is in place and that is getting the right results. So we have employees who want to give the best care, and actually what the result is best care. So we need to be very clear what evidence we're going to use to gauge human capital management. It might sound odd in the very early part of the 21st century to be asking the question whether management methods are evidence-based or not. Surely most successful organisations have based most of their management decision-making on some form of evidence. Well, there are two professors at Stanford, Jeffrey Pfeffer and Robert Sutton, who've come to the conclusion that actually evidence-based management is not as common as you might think. And they say, first and foremost, that evidence-based management is a way of seeing the world and thinking about the craft of management. It's a whole different mindset, in effect. Evidence-based management is based on the belief that facing the hard facts about what works and what doesn't will help organisations perform better. Pfeffer and Sutton don't particularly target the HR community, but I think it's fair to say that managing people is the one area that most organisations have been reluctant to apply very obvious evidence-based approaches. And human capital management now requires a much more evidence-based approach to people management. People like Pfeffer and Sutton have really raised this question of what is good evidence. And in fact, when you apply that directly to the question of human capital management, we need a clear definition of what we're really trying to achieve here. Now, one organisation that came up with a definition that might help was a body called the Accounting for People Task Force, which was set up in the UK, and it produced a report in 2003. And we'll look at what it said really needed to happen for human capital management and reporting to actually mean anything. Human capital management is intrinsically an evidence-based approach to managing human capital. And if you want to be a consummate professional human capital manager, you must have a clear understanding of what human capital management really means. And the first thing is, it has to be strategic. Now, one organisation that defined human capital management was a body called the Accounting for People Task Force, that the UK Department of Trade and Industry asked to look at this issue some years ago. Here is their definition of what human capital management really means. They said it's an approach to people management that treats it as a high-level strategic issue and seeks systematically to analyse, measure and evaluate how people, policies and practices create value. I can't disagree at all with this definition. I think it's a perfect definition of what professional human capital management is all about. So let us take two ideas here, evidence-based management, human capital management, and put them together with what we might call conventional business reporting. And we'll take a look at three comparable businesses which are all in the airlines industry, British Airways, Ryanair and Southwestern Airlines, and see if we can read into some of the conventional data that is reported, some of the human implications, the human capital management implications of what's going on in these organisations. This is going to be a bit of detective work, and again it's a key skill, I think, for a true professional. One of the reasons human capital management is so revolutionary is that it forces chief executives to view their organisational performance very, very differently, because basically it says you have all this human capital at your disposal, so what use do you make of it? Now let's just try this out very quickly by looking at three airlines. Here are some figures from everything from passenger numbers, employees to market capitalisation, profits. This is the sort of data that we could get any day for any organisation, and admittedly it is a snapshot, but let's just do a very simple piece of analysis on this just to see what human capital management questions really ask. Let us look, for example, at the number of employees employed at British Airways, which is 45,000, compared to Ryanair's only 3,500. And then if we go to the bottom line here and talk about the market value per employee, British Airways only manages to get $88,000 out of each employee, compared to $1.8 million achieved by Ryanair. Now this is going to make the chief executive of British Airways look pretty foolish compared to the chief executive of Ryanair, and they'd better have some good answers as to why this situation is the way it is. Human capital management analysis is a very, very powerful analytical tool, and one of the exercises on this module will encourage you to do more of this sort of analysis. One thing you will notice from the slide we've just looked at is that it is just a snapshot, and one of the problems with snapshots of organisations is it doesn't tell us anything really that we really need to know about people management. It's just a point in time, and there are so many things outside of the organisation's control that will influence figures like these, share price and profits and all sorts of things, whether the economy is doing well and whether people want to fly. So it doesn't really tell us much about the people side of the organisation, whether people are being really managed well, but it does help us to pose more and more questions. Now let's take this a step further and look at another table, but this time rather than a single snapshot, we're going to take several snapshots and try and build up a trend line, a picture of what's been happening in organisations over a much longer period of time, because this is the sort of information we need to do a proper organisational analysis about how human capital is being managed on a regular, ongoing basis. Because human capital management is strategic, it needs to be asking the same sort of questions that any observer of organisational performance would ask. And one of the key questions would be to say what's happened to market capitalisation of a business over a long period. This would give us a trend line to say whether the business is growing or not. Although we can never take snapshot information totally face value, we have to look at the context in which it is set. So here we have two snapshots, 2002 and 2009. Let's just ask a few questions from a human capital angle. If we look at Toyota's market capitalisation according to these figures, it hasn't changed very much. If we look at General Motors, which was a company that was making about the same number of vehicles as Toyota, it was worth a lot less than Toyota in 2002, and currently it's filed for bankruptcy and is a very, very small organisation in terms of market capitalisation. So one question we need to ask is, has a poor management of human capital contributed to this relatively poor performance of General Motors against one of its top competitors, Toyota? We could also ask the same question of General Electric, which was run by Jack Welch and made into the #1 company in the world in terms of size. Its market capitalisation has more than halved over the same period. And again, what has been happening in terms of getting the best value out of human capital over this period? An even more interesting question would be of Microsoft, which has fallen from #2 to #7, and its market capitalisation has dropped by about 150 billion. At the same time that its arch rival now, Google, has entered the Global 500 rankings and seems to be moving forward rapidly. Now the questions the human capital manager would ask is, has Microsoft's relative decline had anything to do with poor human capital management? But also, has Google's success had anything to do with good human capital management? Or is it really down to two founders who produced an almost unique product that is in huge demand? We need to do this analysis if we're going to really get to the bottom of whether an organisation is doing human capital management well or not. And again, there is an exercise on this for this module. Of course, all the companies in the table we've just seen are commercial companies. They're there to make a profit. They're part of the capitalist system. And as we know from recent history, the capitalist system doesn't always get it right. So we need to look at indicators that really get underneath the skin of organisations. We can't just look at their profits or their market capitalisation. And what we might do to help us in this endeavour is move outside of the commercial private sector and go and look at a very, very large organisation in the UK, the National Health Service, one of the largest employers in the world, employs about 1.3 million people. So if we're going to ask questions about human capital management, what better organisation to look at to consider whether they are getting the best value out of 1.3 million people? Let's have a look at some more charts. Let us now look at an organisation that is not a commercial public company. It doesn't have a profit motive and it doesn't have any market capitalisation. So let's have a look at some indicators here in order to do a basic analysis of whether it is managing its human capital well or not. In this chart on the bottom left hand, we have some expenditure figures and some productivity figures, and we can see very clearly that whilst the bar chart showing a huge increase in expenditure between 1990 and 2004, the corresponding productivity chart shows a steep decline. This, to an economist, is the law of diminishing returns in action. Too much money is being pumped into an organisation that doesn't know how to use its resources well. Let's have a look at some data at the top of these charts. Here we have the number of operations completed in 1998-1999 of 6.4 million compared to 2003 and 2004 of only 6.7 million. That's an increase of just 4.6%. And if operations are anything to measure the NHS by, then there's been a very, very small increase for this huge increase in expenditure. There are some serious human capital management questions that need to be answered by the NHS. What's particularly interesting looking at the NHS as a case study is not only that it's a huge organisation and do we know how to manage the people in such huge organisations, but I think a more important and more interesting question is the NHS learning how to become better at what it does, how to get more value out of its people? One of the graphs we've just seen is a classic case of the law of diminishing returns, where pumping more and more resources, more money into something actually produces less marginal returns at the end of the day. In other words, the business is getting worse rather than better. Now, a business strategy, an organisational strategy, will not automatically include a strategy for how it's going to learn how to get better. So what we need to do is have an HR strategy, of which part of that is going to be a learning strategy, that is totally integrated with the business strategy. But we're going to look at this now as two dimensions of an organisation. And we will start to draw some conclusions that says, if an organisation has a business strategy, even what looks like a good business strategy, if it hasn't got a good HR strategy alongside it, then it is not maximising its potential value. It is not creating as much value as it possibly could. The probability of it continuing to improve is less than if it had a good integrated HR strategy. If we're going to distinguish between organisations that manage their people well and those that don't, even though by all other conventional indicators these businesses seem to be doing well, what we need is to look at the quality of their HR strategy or human capital strategy in relation to the quality of their business strategy, and that's what this simple matrix does. You'll notice immediately that there are no companies in the top left-hand quadrant, and that's because it is very unlikely that a business that doesn't have a very good business strategy is suddenly going to have a very good HR or human capital strategy. You'll also notice there are very few organisations in the top right-hand quadrant, the desirable quadrant, because most of these organisations have not really had any attempts at human capital strategy because it is a very, very new subject. And you'll notice that the number one organisation based in this matrix is Toyota. And regardless of any snapshots we might take of Toyota's performance, there are strong indicators that this is an organisation that is going to continue to hold this high position for the foreseeable future. The first reaction you'll probably have to the matrix we've just seen is there's very, very few organisations put in the top right-hand quadrant. Now, does this mean this is just hypercritical? There are a lot of successful organisations out there that are making lots of good profits. A lot of businesses have been around for many, many years and continue to seem to do well. Yes, but this is a revolutionary idea, human capital management. It's moving the goalpost significantly, and it says however well you seem to be doing in terms of conventional performance indicators, human capital management is a totally different perspective. It's talking about potential. Not how you're doing relative to your competition now, but how you're doing in terms of what you could possibly achieve in the best of all possible worlds, where every person who works for you is given their utmost to help the organisation create as much value as possible. That is the vision of human capital management and human capital strategy, dare I say it. So let's take this vision one step towards reality and start looking at what a human capital management report might actually look like. In 2004, I was asked to write a guide to how you would put together a human capital management report. And you're not expected to read this, but this is an extract from that guide. It was my first attempt at listing all the indicators that an organisation might be asked to report on to show that it was managing its human capital well. So what we're going to do here is actually take a magnifying glass and look at some of the detail of this report on the next slide. Here are some details of a suggested human capital management report. At the top we have the usual suspects of turnover, operating costs and profit, but as we go lower down we get to some more unusual indicators and contraindicators of how well an organisation is managing its human capital. Let's have a look at one or two in a bit of detail. On line 32 we ask the question, is there an effective performance management system in place? How long has it been in place? And what percentage of the workforce are covered by this? Then on line 33 we're looking at a learning system. Does the organisation actually understand what a learning system is? And has it had one in place for more than a year or two? If you do the module on learning strategy, this will do a more in-depth analysis of this particular issue. What about organisation design, another module in this series? Here we have an organisation that's moving from a classical silo type structure to a matrix organisation. But even matrix organisations have their problems, and the real human capital management analyst will know the difference and what to look out for. What about the number of processes that change annually and how long it takes to change a process? If it takes a long time, it suggests the organisation doesn't find it easy to change, so the speed of process change can be quite a good indicator of adaptability. And what about quality assurance systems? Here we have a classic plan, do, check, act system in place, and we would need to know whether this is a real use of the system in the sense that it's part of the learning system. And finally we have a question here about the maturity stage, both in HR terms and learning maturity. Both of these maturity scales are covered throughout this Consummate Professional series. These are all indicators of how well an organisation is likely to perform in the future as much as it is performing today. Well, having completed this module, do you think it's really a revolutionary idea or not? Have you considered what sort of report you might put together for your own organisation now? Interestingly, you'd have to go to your organisation and say, I want to discuss human capital management indicators. And before you even start, there's probably a whole education that has to take place with senior executives who perhaps don't really know what you're talking about, don't know whether it's going to be worthwhile talking about it, have no history of human capital management. There aren't many case studies out there on human capital management doing it properly. So you'd be starting from a very, very low base. In the face of that challenge, you might decide human capital management reporting isn't really what you want to do at the moment. It's not what your organisation is looking for. But now you've completed this module, at least we've opened up a door to a new world of professionalism. That if you are not offering these ideas to your organisation, are you giving the best professional advice that you could? So even if you don't do much about putting together a human capital management report, you should at least, I think, start to put it on the agenda if you're going to regard yourself as a true professional.